Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues and representatives of civil society, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are joining us today from the world. My name is Aldijana Šišić, and I'm Chief of the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women. We are delighted that you could join us for this event, and despite not being in New York this year together, we are comforted by the fact that more people globally can attend and participate in this and all the others important virtual gatherings and exchanges during the Commission of Status of Women. Just before we dive into today's event, just a few housekeeping items to share with everybody. Interpretation is available from English to French, Arabic, Spanish, Russian, and Bosnian. Interpretation can be accessed at the bottom of your Zoom window, where you have a choice of languages. Please note that all participants are muted, but we welcome comments and exchanges of information resources through the chat function, particularly during the second segment of our event. We are recording this event as we speak, and the full recording will be available on the UN Trust Fund's website very shortly after the event today. If you're having any issues with your video or audio, we suggest that you opening the call from the Chrome if you haven't already. We gather here today just 1 year, almost to the date, after COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic by the World Health Organization. And this has been a very difficult year for all of us, but particularly so as we have seen for women and girls, as the context generated by the pandemic has exacerbated rates of violence against women and girls in all forms. We know that these increases in violence are future compounded by the diversion of resources, lack of access to essential services, placing women and girls at a heightened level of risk. And as we have all witnessed in the past year, once again, civil society and women's rights organizations in particular have been the first responders and service providers who stepped in to fill this gap. At our virtual stakeholder meeting, which we hosted in April last year, civil society organizations from India, Rwanda, and Bosnia and Herzegovina and others shared with us their experiences. They told us how they bore witness to the lack of sustainable structural and social support mechanisms and frameworks that are otherwise crucial for the work on preventing and ending violence against women and girls. Today, we will hear from these same organizations again in this first part of our event, as they share with us the progress from the last year, which they made, as well as challenges they continue to face in their respective communities. These challenges in these challenging times, these organizations, like those that will speak today, have often made a difference in saving a woman's or girl's life, saving them from violence and the abuse. To illustrate this fact and to ground today's event in the UN Trust Fund's Survivor Center perspective, we would like to share with you a short video testimony of a woman who sought and received support from a specialist service provider, Center for Women's Rights, noting that the organization is the UN Trust Fund grantee and its representative is one of our panelists today. So let's see this video, please.
Proces nasilja, bio je težak za mene, pošto sam neko smatrala da žena ipak treba biti domaćica i treba biti tim muškim pokorna i ne znam. On je iskoristio to moje stanje i to moje možda i odgoj gdje je žena odgojena da sluša i služi i iskoristio je moje povjerenje. ali došlo je do tog trenutka gdje mi je stavio nož pod vrat i ne mogu opisati taj osjećaj kad vam čitav život proleti ispred očiju, kad pomislite prvo na svoju djecu, da li ćete ih više vidjeti žive i je život uopšte vrijedan neke osobe koja vas uništava i sputava i da stavite tačku na sve, želite da ste slobodni, da živite, jer ništa loše ne radite ako živite normalan život. Jedne prilike, dok me je napao, dok sam bježala od njega, spašavala sam, pala sam na koljena i svijestila sam se, pala sam na koljena kad sam ustala onako na ruke, plakala sam, nisam plakala zbog bola, od udarca nisam ga ni osjetila, plakala sam zbog bola, šta sam sebi dozvolila, kao žena, imala sam taj unutrašnji bol, tu fizičku bol čovjek nije ni osjetio dok mi gospođa nije rekla, pa gospođa vi krvarite. Ja sam taj dan kad sam bila povrijeđena samo ponavljala, ne želim da me moja djeca gledaju u ovom stanju. I rekla sam sebi u stvari da to sebi neću više dozvoliti. Ustala sam, borila se za sebe i izborila se. Vidjela sam da u državnim institucijama sve ide sporo, sve nekako sve nespremno na to nasilje, sve treba puno vremena, a u nasilju svega ima samo vremena najmanje. Obraćala sam se u sve ustanove gdje nisam dobivala baš neku pomoć. Bilo je to i vrijeme korone, lockdown je bio. Tako da je sve bilo otežano. Baš sam došla, kad sam htjela da nazovem vas, baš sam bila došla do nekog zida koji je bilo za mene prevelik da ga samo priđem. Posle tog prvog razgovora sam osjetila neku pomoć, neku psihičku, neku podršku. To vam sad ne mogu opisati, ali iste sekunde moj život je nekako se promijenio, jer sam vjerovala da ima neko ko će i sa pravne strane da mi pomogne, da će mi pomoći taj zid da prijeđem ako ništa. Jer sama ne mogu, sama s djecom ne mogu. Jednostavno, u tom momentu, bar meni, ste bili nešto što me potaknulo da ustanim, da krenim. Jednostavno, taj razgovor izgledalo mi je kao neko ko hoće da me sasluša, jer u svim drugim ustanovama sam bila neprihvaćena i toliko mi je dala podrške i toliko mi je rekla da se to sve može, da se to ne smije raditi, da će stati za mene i za djece i toliko mi je dala ohrabrenje. Zahvalila bi se Centru za ženska prava. Sad sam dosta stabilnija, jača osoba, spremna sama da se suprotstavim nekim životnim izazovima, ali ipak neka i njih tu čovjek se osjeća sigurniji. Uz pomoć vas, prijavila sam to nasilje i poručila bi svim ženama da niko ne treba da se boji, jer nijedna žena ne treba da proživljava neku vrstu nasilja, sve smo mi vrijedne.
And what a powerful story this is, and there is no additional words needed. I hope that this story provides insight also in why, since March of the last year, the UN Trust Fund's top priority and focus have been on supporting and enabling our civil society partners to adapt their project activities according to these emerging needs of their beneficiaries, as well as the COVID restrictions. At the same time, during this period, we have continued to strongly advocate for increasing direct support to civil society organizations for the very reasons that we have also seen in this video, and in recognition of their role as first responders to enormous impact of this crisis on women and girls. Today's event is in line with that advocacy. As per our mandate, we continue to highlight and champion these voices, the efforts and the impact of civil society organizations. We call for increased resourcing and for mutually enabling partnerships between governments, civil society, and the UN within our shared goals in the ecosystem of ending violence against women and girls. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce United Nations Assistant Secretary General, and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, Ms. Asa Regner, to provide opening remarks and to frame our event within the context of the UN Women's overall response to the COVID pandemic. Dear Asa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Aldidiana, and thank you for having me here today. So excellencies, ministers, colleagues, friends, partners from civil society. Aldidiana, I do think that the video really framed this event and why we have to have it and why we need to discuss these issues. I also think that it very, very clearly showed what civil society often does. It defends, protects other women, and it also raises women's human rights. And as the video showed in the end, this is about rights, it's about dignity, and it is about the possibility to for life to take a new turn and for the woman to decide and define what she wants to do with her own life and her own space. So, as Aldiana said, this event will highlight how the COVID pandemic has exacerbated violence. We estimate from UN Women's side that it has increased with 20 to 30% this last year. The violence from partners, most often from men that women live with or know well, and how this impacted individual women, obviously, but also civil society organizations which are often working on the front lines of the response. Also, as you said, Aldiana, a year ago, since I am the Assistant Secretary General responsible for the Commission on the Status of Women, which is ongoing, as you know, last year I was the first in this capacity to postpone or actually cancel the Commission on the Status of Women the way we know it. That was no fun, but we all know now why that was necessary. So we convene in this online format a year after that. And we know that during the last year, we both took stock of the Beijing 25 advancements, and now we also add 1 year of COVID experience. And when it comes to what had happened 25 years after we decided upon the global action plan that the Beijing platform actually is for gender equality, when we take stock on the issues on violence against women, we know on the one hand that governments have responded to a larger extent these last, let's say, 10 years or so with legislation, reforms, training of police, other measures to encounter violence against women. But we also know that violence levels have not been impacted, unfortunately. They have rather spiked this last year. And so we can not see that reality has changed to a large extent for women, although obviously the political engagement is a good development, but what we need and what women have the right to see is change in real life. So a year ago, when the COVID lockdowns started to emerge in different countries, we heard from women's rights organizations. They were the first to alert us about how measures to curb the spread were actually impacting women who were living with violent men. So since the beginning of the crisis, UN Women and the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women have been committed to supporting and to amplifying the work of women's rights organizations in serving these needs of women and girls. We think that flexibility and adaptive capacity have been key to our institutional response. And this is also reflected in the UN Trust Fund's 5-point action plan that aim to assist over 140 grantees in adapting their interventions to the COVID-19 crisis and these particular circumstances, and obviously women's needs. Also, together with the EU-UN Spotlight Initiative, which is an initiative to prevent violence against women and to address violence against women actively all over the world, UN Women and UN agencies were also able to repurpose $21 million to flexibly respond to these needs of women and girls. This included $9 million, which were awarded by the UN Trust Fund to 44 grantees in sub-Saharan Africa. This flexible funding contributed to organizations' resilience and institutional survival through the crisis. Since we also know that the conditions for civil society in general have been even harsher this year. By the end of this month, the UN Trust Fund will allocate an additional $15 million to the civil society organization, women's rights organizations, working to prevent and end violence against women and girls specifically during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is thanks, and I really want to thank you in this room to the additional support provided by the governments of Sweden, Canada, and the UK, among others. Already on Monday, we are opening up the Generation Equality Forum in Mexico. And I'm sure that the co-leaders of the Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence, also the one on feminist leaderships, as well as the one on economic justice and rights, some of you are here today, will agree that the strengthened alliances and collaboration between women's rights organizations and governments will be key to achieving the goals set forth across the Action Coalitions while we work to rebuild societies and a world post-COVID-19. I think that this last year has and continues to take a toll on all of us, individually and collectively, and not least women who found themselves in this situation. Challenges persist to financing efforts to end the violence against women and girls in the aftermath of the crisis. So we remain convinced, more convinced than ever, that the key role that women's rights organizations play is there when it comes to saving the lives of women and girls. And I think that has become even more evident during this year. As you know, the Secretary General came out early, a year ago, pointing to the increased risk of lockdowns, etc., and the risk it could have in relation to higher levels of violence against women. Well, the risk that men would be violent to women, I think it's important to talk about what this really is about, as was also shown in the film. As many as 146 member states responded to the Secretary General's appeal, and they actually also did something. They did strengthen and support measures in their countries as response to that appeal and to the higher levels of violence in their countries. However, these measures were too few, they were too ad hoc, they were not funded enough, and they were not organized in a way so that they were as strong as they needed to be. So again, civil society took on a role to protect and defend other women, and they were also filling out, as always, needs that many times municipalities, regions, and governments should actually be responsible for. So we think that championing the leadership of feminist movements and civil society actors, together with feminist national and foreign policies, and you represent that, the countries who are here today, and the work of multilateral organizations, we continue to set the example to galvanize efforts to end violence against women and girls globally. We cannot afford and must not allow for any reversal in the progress we have achieved so far for women and girls. In fact, we need to accelerate. So thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you everybody for participating in this extremely important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Osla. And indeed, as you said, the championing our collective action based on feminist leadership of civil society and government leaders at all levels that's what will create the progress. And what a great pleasure for me is to say that actually your country, Osa, Sweden, I believe, was the first state to announce its feminist foreign policy in 2014, just as you were stepping in as I believe, minister into your term until 2018. The policy set the fourth, very comprehensive agenda for change, to strengthen the rights, representation, and resources for all women and girls. Sweden's international development cooperation provided quick and steady response to the COVID-19 pandemic, prioritizing its partners' ability to adjust according to immediate needs and to maximize aid effectiveness, and to which the Trust Fund can testify directly. It is now my distinct honor to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Per Olsenfrid, Minister for International Development Cooperation of Sweden. Your Excellency, the floor is yours, and thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, Excellencies, colleagues, and distinguished participants. It's such an honor for me to join you here today, and thank you to the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women for organizing this event and for inviting me here to speak. We have had a year now of COVID-19, and we have had a year of backsliding. Hard-won gains for human rights, for gender equality and access to SRHR are being rolled back as we speak. And in times of crisis, violence increase, and the isolation has made it even worse. We have seen a sharp increase in violence against women and girls during the past year. We have seen the pandemic being exploited as an opportunity to deny women sexual reproductive health and rights. Women have been told to stay at home, even though home often is the most dangerous place for women facing violence. Due to the lockdowns, it's been much more difficult to seek help, to get support, and to access that support that could be a question of life. In many places, women's shelters that help survivors have not been categorized as essential, and the organizations on the front lines not deemed essential service providers, so they've struggled to operate. And all this is clearly the result of an incomplete analysis of the needs of a society in crisis. Now, my government is a feminist government. Few things make me more proud. We conduct a feminist foreign policy. In all times, on all levels, in all societies, women have been subordinated to men when it comes to rights, representation, and resources. And this means that my colleagues and I need to ensure in every decision we make that women and girls have the same rights, the same duties, and all the same opportunities as men and boys. The equality goal is based on the fundamental belief that of the equal value of men and women, of us as human beings. Sustainable peace, security, development, you name it, cannot be achieved if we half the world's population, and if half of the world's population is excluded. So women's access to health, including sexual and reproductive health and rights, as well as access to employment and many more things, is critical for their ability to live independent lives and for societies to prosper. Both girls and boys must have the chance to go to school, to finish education, acquire necessary knowledge and skills, to stand up for themselves, to raise their voice, make their own informed choices, including over their own bodies, and fully participate in society. We've learned and we know that when we empower women and girls, we empower their families, their future families, we empower communities, nations if you want, ultimately the way we can eradicate poverty. So in calling both our foreign policy and our development cooperation for feminist, we set the bar and we create expectations. My hope is that Sweden will help set a precedent in terms of commitment to gender equality. Supporting women's rights organizations in their work is our most critical task, because your role in driving positive change cannot be understated. Our Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, is operating based on the belief that sexual and gender-based violence is preventable. We know, for example, that men who agree with rigid gender norms are more likely to commit violence against women than men who believe in gender equality. Therefore, Sweden supports strategic programs that addresses the root causes by targeting young people and social norms. In response to persisting gender inequalities and an impatience to make progress, the Swedish government adopted a global thematic strategy for gender equality in 2018, worth 100 million euros over a 4-year period. The strategy is a strategic complement to existing strategies to ensure support for global actors at a time when gender equality work is meeting increasingly or increased resistance around the world. When the pandemic hit the world, Sweden realized that we must be flexible with necessary adjustments to ensure partners' sustainability and capacity to provide a relevant response. Many of the women's rights organizations have most of their funding provided through project support. When projects couldn't be carried out due to the pandemic, survival of the organizations as such were at risk. The past year have taught us about trust, interdependence, and flexibility. We are more aware than ever before about our dependence on our partners to get relevant information and make smart decisions. We're grateful for their gratitude, their guidance, and we need to continue trusting their experience. The past year has also reaffirmed our belief that flexible core funding is critical. Core funding is what allowed so many of our partners to survive through the pandemic, but not only survive, but what could keep them rolling out relevant work, saving lives. We believe that our feminist foreign policy helps keep a systematic gender perspective at the fore, ensuring preparedness in times of crisis. Women must be at the table to discuss the response and help find solutions for recovery. The world needs to use this crisis as a lever. We can't waste it. We need to use it as a lever to find a structural change to implement policies that eliminates these root causes of violence against women and girls and makes strides towards gender equality. We need to work towards transformed norms around gender relations, around masculinity. And we also need vigilance against failing to apply to a gender perspective. When old habits prevail, they assume that a male perspective is gender neutral. We've now seen the danger of such one-dimensional analysis and the effect it has on women's health, safety, the right to live freely without the fear of violence. In our struggle to achieve gender equality, Sweden is working to establish feminist development cooperation as the new norm. But we have to keep pushing, and we have to keep pushing together. So thank you again, UN Trust Fund. You've been an invaluable partner to us, and we're so grateful for the life-saving work that you and your partner organizations around the world have achieved, also during this crisis. The fight must go on, the struggle continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. And once again, thank you to Sweden, not just for your enduring commitment to this issue, but for your leadership, your clear and very constructive and specific leadership on this issue. Now we will move to our interactive panel discussion. And before handing that over to a moderator of that part of our event, please allow me to introduce the moderator and all speakers. Our moderator is also from the country with Feminist International Assistance Policy. Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy has placed women's rights organizations firmly at the center of its efforts and actions for building a more inclusive and prosperous world. It is my great pleasure to introduce Her Excellency the Honorable Karina Gould, Minister for International Development of Canada, who will moderate this exchange. Minister Gould will be joined by Mr. Martin Seychelles, Deputy Director of DG International Partnership of the European Commission and co-leader of the Gender Equality Action Coalition on Gender based violence, and Canada is also leads on Action Coalition on Feminist Movements and Partnerships. Finally, on our panel, the presidents and executive directors of 3 civil society organizations currently supported by the UN Trust Fund, who I mentioned at the top of the event. Ms. Meliha Sendic from the Center for Women's Rights of Bosnia and Herzegovina, whose videos we have seen. Ms. Gaudans Mushimiyimana, sorry Gaudans, from UNABU of Rwanda, and Ms. Rashmi Singh from PCVC of India. Those 3 organizations are among the many partners of the UN Trust Fund's grantee portfolio who are continuously informing us of the complex and localized context of the pandemic. Your Excellency, Minister Gold, now over to you to guide us through this cross-sectoral exchange, and thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Adriana, and good morning from Canada. I'm very pleased to join you today, and I have to say a special greeting to my dear friend Per Olsen-Fried from Sweden, with whom Canada is very pleased to work with and advance our feminist agenda. And I was very heartened by his words this morning. I want to take a moment just to reflect on the incredibly powerful video that kind of set the stage for today's event, and the strong message that we are all worthy. I don't know about you, but when I saw that video, it gave me chills. It made me feel so many different emotions of thinking about what that woman went through, and then how finding someone who would listen to her and support her changed her life. And I think that's what today's panel is all about. I'm honored to join you today to speak about the issue of violence against women and girls, particularly within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the essential role that civil society organizations and women's rights organizations play, including as frontline responders. And following my remarks, I will moderate a panel discussion that will focus on civil society perspectives on the impacts of COVID-19 and how we have adapted 1 year on. For Canada, ending sexual and gender-based violence is a central part of our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In this work, we are guided by our Feminist International Assistance Policy. This policy helps us to change the systems that discriminate against half the population, but also helps us identify, address, and transform power dynamics. It means taking an intersectional, human rights-based approach, both in what we do and in how we do it. It means concerted and intentional anti-racist action in our programming and processes. It means seeking out the most vulnerable and most marginalized and supporting their voices. And of course, it means preventing and responding to all forms of sexual and gender-based violence for women and girls in all of their diversity. Because we know that disproportionate numbers of women and girls face multiple and intersecting forms of violence, discrimination, and socioeconomic marginalization. That is why Canada is so proud to support the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women, the only global grant-making mechanism exclusively dedicated to eradicating all forms of violence against women and girls in all of their diversity. The Trust Fund's record is quite impressive. Since 1996, you have supported over 500 civil society-led initiatives that have addressed violence against women and girls through innovative and evidence-based solutions. From the very start of this pandemic, you have recognized the gender dimensions of COVID-19 and brought attention to the challenges that civil society, especially women's rights organizations, have had to face. Importantly, the Trust Fund put in place an action plan to help civil society organizations and women's rights organizations adapt and fulfill their roles as first responders and essential service providers. These grassroots organizations are on the front lines, pivoting quickly to meet the needs of women and girls, helping to mitigate the risks of violence, and amplifying the voices and visibility of survivors, including those most at risk. The video showed us clearly just how important that work is. In 2020, Global Affairs Canada allocated additional resources to support the work of grassroots feminist organizations and respond to the needs of survivors of violence. Recognizing that in many countries, health services, in particular for women and girls, have been disrupted due to lockdowns and diverted resources. Canada's COVID response has prioritized funding to support the empowerment of women and girls, maintain access to sexual and reproductive health services, address SGBV, and support local women's rights organizations. Of course, it is essential that women and girls in all of their diversity be included in the decisions that affect them, including those decisions related to the COVID-19 response. And it is why events such as this one play an important role in amplifying the voices of civil society. We have so much to learn from women's rights organizations and civil society partners. The discussion we are having here today will also help inform the work being done on the Generation Equality Forum Action coalitions. So let me close my remarks by saying how proud we are to work with UN Women, the UN Trust Fund, and the friends and like-minded partners such as Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the European Union to help support the important work of civil society organizations and women's rights organizations in particular. They are a cornerstone of Canada's feminist approach, never more so than in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And today, as we know, we will hear from a global panel of remarkable change makers and activists who are at the front line of responding to the needs of women and girls during the pandemic in their communities. Our panelists today are Mr. Martin Seychelles, Deputy Director at the European Commission, responsible for international partnerships, including the Spotlight Initiative. Ms. Rashmi Singh, Program Director of the International Foundation for Crime Prevention and Victim Care. Ms. Milija Sendic, President of the Center of Women's Rights in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Ms. Godence Mushimiyamana, co-founder and executive director of the Rwandan Organization of Women with Disability. We are fortunate to have with us representatives from the same civil society organizations who were present at our first stakeholder meeting in April of last year, when we first looked at the issue of violence against women against the backdrop of a pandemic. These speakers will be able to speak to both the progress and the challenges we have faced over the last year. Each panelist will speak to their perspectives on the theme of women's leadership in crisis in ending violence against women for 3 minutes. We will then have a second round of 1 to 2 minute interventions to finish our conversation. So let's get started because they are much more interesting to hear from than I am. So I'm going to start with Ms. Singh. Ms. Singh, you do some truly incredible work, and I'd love to hear what lessons you have learned from your work supporting survivors of acid burn attacks during COVID-19. How has the pandemic affected violence against women and girls in India generally, and what specifically has been impacted by your organization and how you've implemented projects? Ms. Singh, over to you.
Thanks. I would like to begin with that the project which is being supported by the UN Trust Fund from PCVC is for the burn survivors, a particular group we work with, apart from working with the larger group of women and queer individuals. But for UN Trust Fund, that was the focus of the project when we started. And when the pandemic hit and the lockdown started, we have a 24 hours by 7 crisis line. Of course, the hospitals closed, the burn wards closed because of the lockdown. So we stopped getting women burn survivors in the hospital. But at the same, that doesn't mean that violence wasn't happen. But actually, globally, domestic violence increased, and we were all seeing. Now, when we looked at our 24 by 7 hotline, which we have, suddenly in the first 2 weeks, we saw a steep dip in the calls, which came down to around 2 to 3 calls in a week, which actually used to be 10 to 15 calls per day. And then we were like, domestic violence is increasing and it is going to increase because of the lockdown and economic crisis, but the calls have dipped. And one of the reasons for that was that when the government declared essential services list, these services were not very clearly mentioned on that list. That was one. The other was women normally reach out by phone. And then because with everyone being at home, it was not possible for them. So what we escalated was our chat services. So we were available more on WhatsApp. Women were able to message us at any time and all of that. But our crisis calls increased, but women did not resort to moving out or coming to the shelter because there was also the fear of the pandemic. Now, with all of this, the kind of violence which was reported was the intensity of the violence increased. So, if earlier it was emotional, it also became sexual and physical. So, the manifestation increased. Queer individuals who were working outside the city, when they returned back home, their families, disclosed about their sexuality. There were a lot of pressure on forced marriages, on women. The household chore burden increased, violence increased because of men losing jobs, women not having the opportunity to step out or find these safe spaces for them to even connect with their social support network. So it increased in different ways, the violence which was happening on women. And of course mobility was completely restricted. Coming down to our services, we of course we scaled up our services to setting up at isolation rooms in the shelter itself, because the teams were working from home, and also having like tying up with the government for the COVID tests, because all the protocols. But what pattern we saw was there were fewer number of women who resorted to coming or stepping down to the shelter, but definitely the surge on demand through our helpline was women wanting to talk to someone, and then these services being available for them at a time which was possible for them to talk. So that was, I think, that's how we quickly tweaked our services as well, because that was the demand. And I think, and that was the exact time when UN Trust Fund also approached to say, okay, this is what the project is, but what do we need at this point of time? And then that was the time when there was made a shift in the design, moving from just to burn survivors to all domestic violence survivors, and then of course repurposing of the project activities as well. So by and large, I will say that yes, the pandemic of domestic violence, like a shadow, it followed the pandemic of COVID-19. But I think parallelly, which was important and which geared up was stepping up and gearing up to the needs, and that was, I think, a big learning for all of us. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rashmi, and thank you for the incredible work that your organization is doing to support survivors of sexual and gender-based violence and domestic violence in India. I think what you were talking about in terms of pivoting is something that so many frontline workers can relate to right around the world. Next, I would like to turn to Godense to speak to us about her organization, the Rwandan Organization of Women with Disabilities. How did support from the UN Trust Fund help you respond to the needs of women and girls living with disabilities in the rural areas of Rwanda? Godense, over to you, please.
Thank you. The extra funding that we got from UN Trust Fund for institutional strengthening has been relevant for our organization, Rwanda Organization of Women with Disabilities, as a small organization of women at the grassroots level, because they were able to enhance our resilience to COVID-19 situation in accordance to the situation that was shared by my colleague, and even what you have been seeing through the video. But also the budget were adjusted to respond to emerging needs and adapting to the COVID situation. With the adjusted budget, the core fund for small organization, but also we have a self-care fund for small organization. We were able to cover some administrative expenses like insurance for our staff, transport during the COVID-19 for accessing essential services, attending health centers, but also supporting girls and women with disabilities at the community level. We were also able to reconnect with the community, because with the situation, we were totally disconnected with the community with the lockdown. But with the funding, we were able to reconnect through purchasing and distributing smartphones to our volunteers from the community, so that we keep in touch. They can access support regularly, emotional and psychosocial support, advisory services to access justice, but also they can access training materials through their smartphone. That was also important to keep in touch with the community during the lockdown. But also we have been able to distribute food and also hygienic materials, because we know with the COVID-19, mostly girls and women with disabilities have been lacking access to essential services, including even the pads, food. Their livelihood condition was really affected, and then we were able to support urgently girls and women with disability in need of such kind of services, food, hygienic materials, and even soap, to make sure that they protect themselves from the infection of COVID-19. On the other side, we established toll-free line to make sure that girls and women with disabilities can freely access at any time advisory services. Those who are victims of violence can be referred to services for free of charge, because most of them have no access to mobile phones, access to technologies in general. So we're able to establish toll-free line so that they can at any time have access to emotional support, but also any other advice they need during the lockdown. We were able to also make sure that we are outsourcing services, other persons, to make sure that we have funds to sustain, because with the economic crisis, it was really not insured for small organizations like ours to sustain beyond COVID-19. So with the fund, we also outsourced consultant to support us through proposal development, to make sure that we can access more funding for the organization to continue to sustain, maintain staff, but also responding to the needs of girls and women with disabilities at higher risk of violence. We were able really to better respond to COVID-19 economic crisis, because we updated our organizational tools, strategic plan, to make sure that we comply with the requirement on the market of fundraising, so that we can continue accessing fund, but also we're able to put in place fundraising strategies. Those are the core institutional document that any small organization and even a big organization may need to make sure that we can access more funding on the fundraising market. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gadense, for sharing your experience and the work that your organization is doing. And I think it reflects so much of what we've heard in Canada from women's rights organizations, that it's not just pivoting your existing activities, but also responding to COVID-19 and providing those direct supports, like you mentioned, in terms of providing food and soap. So again, thank you so much for all that you do and sharing your experience with us on the front lines in Rwanda. Now let's hear from Martin Seychelles from the European Commission, a partner in strengthening feminist movements and women's rights organizations, to learn more about how the UN Spotlight Initiative has helped build resilience among feminist and women's rights organizations that are responding to the crisis. Martin?
Thank you very much. Hello to everyone. And let me start by saying how happy I am to be here with you nearly 1 year after the first exchange we've had on the impact of this crisis on civil society organizations. Civil society organizations, as well as young people, are a personal priority for our Commissioner Urpilainen, and your insights and experience are very important to us. We are very aware, of course, of the key role played by women's organizations in delivering services within their communities and in having women's and girls' voices heard. With the crisis, as we've just heard as well, many organizations were confronted with previously unseen challenges. Access to beneficiaries became nearly impossible. We had to embrace a new virtual world. Contingency plans had to be made in practically no time, and the well-being of staff had to be ensured as well. And in the meantime, the needs and the urgencies on the ground were only growing, and they still are, unfortunately. Now, the EU-UN Spotlight Initiative dedicates an important part of its support to the women's movement, women's rights and feminist organizations, and the initiative helps them build their capacity to carry out their advocacy work while protecting themselves, for example, by networking more efficiently with others. Now, in the last year, the initiative has been very swift to act. In the past months, more than $21 million of Spotlight funds have been redirected to address violence against women and girls in the context of the COVID-19 response. And special efforts have been made to boost prevention measures and reinforce services using a variety of innovative approaches. We have been really amazed, positively amazed, to see in such a short time frame how well our civil society partners have responded. We've seen more mobile clinics and the shuttle service in Zimbabwe, for example, additional shelters in Nigeria, more economic activities, new economic activities involving making soap and masks in Mozambique, virtual referral and response services in El Salvador, online consultations with pro bono lawyers in Kyrgyzstan, many others, such wonderful examples. And COVID-19 preventative measures were incorporated in the outreach activities swiftly. We welcomed and used digital innovation, and protection material was delivered to ensure the continuation of service delivery to survivors. Just a few examples, many more I could mention. With the support of the Trust Fund, who did a great job in adapting the working modalities to the crisis, a rapid support was provided to 44 women's and grassroots organizations by providing them with the much needed lifelines so they could survive and continue to operate effectively and respond rapidly and safely while continuing to deliver frontline services to women and girls. And in a number of countries, we have seen civil society groups meeting spontaneously to exchange on possible solutions on how best to tackle this crisis. So yes, it's been a difficult year, but it's really so encouraging to see civil society partners, and more particularly women's organizations, just how much they've demonstrated resilience, creativity, and how much they've been able to lead by example in the response to this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Martin, and thank you to the EU's leadership as well in terms of funding women's rights organizations. And I think one of the things that you mentioned that we're always impressed with in Canada is how agile women's rights organizations are, but for the UN Trust Fund for Violence Against Women, how they really listen to partners on the ground and respond to their needs. So thank you once again, Martin, for that. Our last panelist to speak is Milija Sendic, President of the Center of Women's Rights in Bosnia and Herzegovina. You will all recall our opening video and how the Center of Women's Rights provides important services to survivors of gender-based violence in Bosnia. Milija, can you tell us more about the role of your organization in keeping women and girls safe? And just a reminder for those who require simultaneous interpretation, the buttons are on the lower left of your screen. It looks like a little world and you can choose the language that you require interpretation into. Milija, over to you.
Dobar dan. Ja bi sve da vas pozdravim i da se zahvalim što imam priliku ponovo da učestvujem na jednom ovakvom bitnom događaju i da skrenem još jednom pažnju na probleme s kojima se susreću žene, mogu govoriti u Bosni i Hercegovini. Čuli ste, vidjeli ste, naježili ste se, izazvalo je razne emocije, video koje ste imali priliku da pogledate, a to je naša svakodnevnica s kojom se susrećem ja i moje kolegice radeći da bi pomogle ovim ženama koji se nama javljaju. Mislim da je video sasvim dovoljno, govori ono šta mi radimo i šta u stvari pokušavamo ženama da, na koji način ženama pokušavamo da pomognemo. Iako mi je svakodnevnica, vjerujte da mi nije bilo baš jednostavno pogledati i slušati ovaj video. Sada sam ga malo slušala na drugačiji način i kod mene je izazvalo baš jake emocije, jer nije mala stvar govoriti za 4000 žena koje ja sada u ovom momentu zastupam. COVID-19 će proći, ali da li će se išta promijeniti u sistemu zaštite? Kada sam prije godinu dana postavila ovo pitanje sebi, ali svima vama, na ovom istom događaju, negdje duboko u sebi sam mislila znala sam u stvari odgovor da neće. Nažalost, to moje pitanje i neka unutarnja konstatacija se obistinila i mogu reći da u ovom momentu, u ovom trenutku u Bosni i Hercegovini je situacija, ne mogu reći da je ista, pošto se otprilike zna s čim se susrećemo, ali da je ona katastrofalna. Mi se nismo pomjerili baš s nekog mjesta. Meni je jako žao što ja to govorim, ali je to jedna činjenica koju ja moram da naglasim i mora se čuti ono s čim se mi susrećemo u Bosni i Hercegovini. Bosna i Hercegovina nije imala odgovor ni na početku pandemije, a nema ga ni danas. Nema nikakav sistemski odgovor na problem nasilja nad ženama, a posebno u uslovima pandemije. Kako je to sve utjecalo na žrtve tokom protekle godine? Vidjeli ste u videu, a mogu vam još neke detalje reći vezano za neke druge probleme s kojima se žene susreću. Ako prijave nasilje, budu izbačene iz kuće i stana. Dodatni problem je ako je ta imovina na ime muža ili njegovih roditelja, kao što je u većini slučajeva u Bosni i Hercegovini. Ostvarivanje prava na dio stana ili te kuće može se dokazivati, ali postupak je dugotrajan. I šta sada radimo u toku tog perioda, odnosno tog procesa koji je tako dugotrajan? Sudska praksa u Bosni i Hercegovini je takva da žrtve nasilja odlaze u sigurnu kuću, a nasilnik ostaje u stanu. Pandemija je postala dodatnu barijeru jer sigurne kuće nisu mogle primati nove korisnice jer nisu ispunile oni uslovi koji su bili potrebni u vrijeme da bi se ispunilo određena očekivanja vezano za mjere koje su tada bile donesene. Zbog toga su bile prisiljene tražiti smještaj kod prijatelja, roditelja. Zajedno sa djecom su se snalazili za osnovne potrepštine, jer iako su bile zaposlene, ostajale su bez posla, bez primanja, prepuštene humanosti poznanika. Svo vrijeme slušali smo primjere drugih država kako obezbjeđuju jednokratne novčane pomoći za svoje stanovnike. U Bosni i Hercegovini nije bilo toga, pa čak ni u najdrastičnijim slučajevima. Morali smo se boriti da bi naše korisnice koje imaju 4 ili 5 djece žive u nekim neuslovnim prostorijama da dobiju pomoć jednokratnu koja nije prelazila 100 km mjesečno. 100 km samo u jednom mjesecu i to im je bilo za cijelu godinu. Nepostojanje adekvatne usluge i institucionalne zaštite je servis koji smo postali od 1996. godine, servis besplatne pravne i psihološke podrške, tokom pandemije je pozicioniralo kao jedan od najrelevantnijih resursa u Bosni i Hercegovini koji je mogao adekvatno odgovoriti na probleme s kojima se susreću žene, ali i institucije. Razvijena ranije strateška partnerstva sa predstavnicima institucija u sistemu zaštite i povjerenje koje su institucije imale prema načinu rada naše organizacije je bio jedan od najvažnijih faktora i važan aspekt urgentnog djelovanja u kriznoj situaciji. Istovremeno, žene su imale povjerenje da ćemo i u uslovima krize zastupati njihove interese i biti njihova osoba od povjerenja, kao što ste mogli čuti i u priči naše žene s kojom smo protekle godine uspjeli zajedno da ona stane na svoje noge i da sada može živjeti samostalno svoj život. Ona je jedan od primjera mnogobrojnih žena koji se susreću sa ovom problematikom i ponavljam još jednom da se ništa nije promijenilo, ništa se nije pomjerilo s mjesta, da je ženama situacija skoro pa ista. Hvala.
Malia, thank you so much for that powerful intervention and also for the work that you're doing. I think, it behooves all of us to keep pushing forward and supporting each other in solidarity, because we cannot have a situation where we end the COVID-19 pandemic worse off than we began it. We know that we don't want to go backwards. We absolutely need to keep moving forwards and to make lives better for women and girls and all of their diversity right around the world. Now, before I get to the next part, I do also just want to point out that in the chat, there is a link to the impact that COVID-19 has had on LGBTQ2I communities as well. And I would invite panelists to take a look at that. We're now going to move on to the final part of this conversation. And interventions, and we want to hear recommendations from you that we can bring forward for discussion at the upcoming Generation Equality Forum in Mexico, particularly regarding the Action Coalition on Feminist Movements and Leadership that Canada co-leads with Malawi and the Netherlands, and the Action Coalition on Ending Violence Against Women and Girls. So I know that's a big ask because there are lots of recommendations, and as you've all highlighted, we have a lot of work to do, but I'm going to ask that you please keep your remarks to 2 minutes each. And I'm going to turn first to Martin, please.
Thank you. 3 points really I would like to make. First one is if we want to prevent and eliminate violence against women and girls in a really transformative manner, we need to follow a comprehensive multi-layered approach, and we need to give a prominent role to play to CSOs in the design, the governance, and the implementation of activities. And that's an area we would be certainly very willing to discuss further, how we could do that in a better way. Secondly, I would like to take this opportunity as well to call on all partners, donors, and funders to be innovative and creative when providing funding to grassroots organizations. They need flexibility. And we need this flexibility if we want to build a sustainable women's movement. So again, another topic I would propose is how we can build in more flexibility into our support. And thirdly, I would like to take this opportunity, if you would allow, to highlight that in the new EU's Gender Action Plan and in our new thematic program for civil society organizations, we have committed to increase the funding to women's and youth organizations and to intensify our dialogue and cooperation with them. So we are very much hoping to engage in a stronger discussion on what more we could do on this important topic. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Martin. So I have to recognize that I might have failed as a moderator and not kept us on time. So instead of giving you all 2 minutes each, I'm going to ask that you each provide us one piece of advice very quickly so that we can hear from you, because you're so important to hear from. And so I'll go to Rashmi and then Godense and then Malia, please.
Yeah. I'll give 2 pieces of advice. One is investment in support services, which has come down in the last 2 decades by the donors. And the second is flexibility. Those are the 2 things, flexibility of utilization of resources.
Go ahead, Godense. Thank you, Rashmi.
Thank you. On my side, I see like more core funding and also flexibility is important to ensure that small organizations, specifically those small organizations of vulnerable groups, women with disability and other group of women with intersecting factors, to be able to respond to COVID and make sure that they sustain, we need more core funding and funds that are flexible to make sure that we respond to institutional, but also to the needs of our constituencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Godense. Malia, final word to you.
Ja ću biti brza kao što sam bila i malo prije, govorila sam tačno u predviđenom vremenu, pa ću ja ipak možda malo više od minute, a bit ću brza stvarno. Prošle godine sam apelirala prema svim UN agencijama, donatorima, partnerima, da tih i jeca žena ne ostane samo unutar 4 zida, da ostane nevidljivi i zanemaren. I moram se zahvaliti svima koji su to prepoznali. Od države smo svakako napuštene, jer šta očekivati od države Bosne i Hercegovine koja zbog političkih neslaganja do sada nije uspjela nabaviti niti vakcine, a kako će se tek zalagati za opstanak organizacija koje su društveno korisne i koje se bave zaštitom žena. Sada vas molim da nas ne ostavljate same u društvu gdje se sve više i više sužava prostor za rad ženskih organizacija i suprotstavljanja nasilja nad ženama. Nadam se da sam bila kratka i da sam ipak ispoštovala, kako ste rekli, Karina, minut.
You were. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists today for raising such important issues and for sharing the really incredible work that you're doing. And I think, the advice that you've given us, don't abandon us, stay with us, more money, more flexible funding, more core funding. I think we all hear you, and certainly those of us who remain committed to funding women's rights organizations are right around the world. Our job is to keep advocating on your behalf and listening to you, because I like how Malia said, we can't let this cry of women go unheard, and we all have an obligation to ensure that we're responding to the needs of women and girls in all of their diversity right around the world, and continue to support the incredible, incredible work that you're doing. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. And I will now pass it back over to Aldiana, the chief at the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women. And thank you so much for today's panel.
Thank you so very much to Minister Gold, and all our panelists for sharing those very deep and important insights and lessons learned. I particularly want to thank our grantees, women's rights organizations, and we will hear from more of our grantees in the second part, for their efforts to ensure that women and girls are protected from violence. Just to keep the time, I will skip the part that I wanted to say right now, because everybody has said such important things. I don't have anything to add, but after hearing these perspectives, and before we close this first part of the event, I would like to invite Ms. Alicia Herbert to provide a few closing reflections to build on what we've heard so far. Ms. Herbert is the United Kingdom Special Envoy on Gender Equality and Director of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office work on education gender equality. United Kingdom is also actively engaged as a co-lead of the Generation Equality Forum Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence. Ms. Herbert, over to you, and thank you. Ms. Herbert, you are on mute.
Okay, sorry, I think I've unmuted. Can you hear me now? Good, it's only been a year. So just to say, huge thanks for that introduction, and as well to say that I am honored and humbled actually to have been asked just to give these closing remarks today, because I've worked on the ground with women's rights organizations in the very early stages of my career. So this is a very, very special event for me. The UK is proud to be a long-term supporter of the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women. And it has been a privilege to hear today the testimonies from those who are on the front lines of that work. We started off the event with that very moving video and a testimony from our sister in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and how she came to a wall, she said, and it seemed insurmountable, but with the help of the Center for Women's Rights, she's now negotiating that wall, because as she said, she is worthy. All women are worthy. We have heard that the COVID-19 pandemic has intensified the multiple forms of violence against women and girls, and how vital services were reduced and safe spaces have been closed. impacting women in all corners of the globe, from India to Rwanda, and different types of women, different categories of women, women who have burnt victims, disabled women, for example. We have heard about the ways in which that you've overcome the additional obstacles and have come up with innovative solutions to support people during lockdown. Toll-free services, for example, were mentioned. And we've heard about the pressing need for core funding and for flexible multi-year investment as well. We know that even before the pandemic, though, that violence against women was at deplorable levels. There's the risk that once the media spotlight moves on from COVID-19, that some will wrongly assume that the violence has stopped. I want to promise you today that our commitment will not stop when the media spotlight moves away. Over the next 5 years, we will use our co-leadership of the GBV Action Coalition to push for more funding and accountability to women's rights organizations and movements on the front line. We also want to champion your meaningful participation in the Action Coalition. And I hope that all of you here today will join as members and as commitment makers. I want to finish by acknowledging that the work you do day in and day out is challenging. It is physically and emotionally difficult to keep going in the face of what may seem to be an unsurmountable tide of violence. But the crucial thing that we all have to remember is that it isn't insurmountable. We know that violence against women and girls is preventable, that it doesn't take generations to see change. A priority for the UK is to work with others through the Action Coalition to harness the transformative potential of education, to shift harmful norms and support healthy relationships from a young age. In other words, to stop violence before it starts. We know that it is possible to end violence and that you are at the forefront of that effort. And so, as I said in the beginning, I am humbled and I'm also inspired by your commitment. And I thank you for all that you do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Herbert, for your closing thoughts and for wrapping up for us this panel. I would like to sincerely thank again all of our speakers and panelists for joining this first segment of our event, and for all of your thoughtful engagement and for your commitment, passion to this work. To offer just 2 closing points from my side as food for thought for our future discussion, and also before I hand over to members of my team who will take us into the second part. It appears that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It's been a year into the COVID, but we might be slowly coming out of the COVID, and vaccine is here. However, we must remain conscious that COVID-19 and its impact may be resolved sooner in developed countries, but it will take much more time for it to be resolved in low-income and developing countries, as we've heard from some of our grantees on their reflections in the situation in their countries. Therefore, consequences of COVID and recovery are still much longer-term project for developing and low-income countries. The second point, the COVID vaccine will eventually reach all countries and we will eradicate COVID. But unfortunately, this is not vaccine that will eradicate pandemic of violence against women and girls. This is why I believe that we must retain our COVID emergency lens in the context of our development cooperation and ending violence against women efforts. And that institutional funding for grassroots organizations in these countries will be crucial to help them and keep them afloat through the challenges and times that are in front of them. UN Women and UN Trust Fund are fully committed to playing our part in this. As an example, and with a great gratitude to all of our donors, including Sweden, Canada, and United Kingdom, I'm delighted to announce that not by the end of the month, but actually tomorrow, the UN Trust Fund will award $15 million to support projects dedicated to addressing violence against women and girls, specifically in the context of the COVID-19. We will also continue to build on evidence that we collect from our civil society partners as relevant to COVID and violence against women, generated from their work and built on their efforts to continue serving and helping women and girls in this COVID. Our new evidence brief will be published in the next few months, and it will build on the knowledge presented on our 2 previous briefs that are result from discussions from our 2 previous consultations. Finally, thank you again. Thank you to our interpreters, and I also want to say thank you to our ICT colleagues. And now I'm handing over to Ms. Fiona Dalmier from my team to take us into the next part of this event. We did plan another video here, but we are going to skip that during the time because of the time, and we might have opportunity to show it at the end of the event so that you can still see it. Fiona, over to you.
Thank you very much, Aldiana. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Buenos dias, bonjour. My name is Fiona Dalmier. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Small Grants Portfolio Manager at the UN Trust Fund. I'm happy to welcome you to the second part of the UN Trust Fund's virtual stakeholder exchange on the impact of COVID-19 on violence against women and civil society 1 year after the pandemic began. In the first half of the session, we heard about lessons learned over the past year about women's leadership in crisis and the importance of investing in women's rights organizations in recognition of these organizations being at the front line of response. In this session, we will hear from 8 technical experts from civil society organizations and member states and dive deeper on these takeaways through the format of a rapid panel discussion. As portfolio manager for small grants in the UN Trust Fund, I've been hearing from our grantees over the past year about the impact of COVID-19. I've heard about the challenges and the impressive and rapid adaptations made to ensure that the delivery of services for survivors of violence can continue and longer-term prevention efforts can maintain momentum. The UN Trust Fund has provided some flexibility and additional funds, including through the support of the Spotlight Initiative, to enable CSOs to organizationally adapt and provide the health and safety measures necessary to protect their staff and their beneficiaries. We have seen organizations implement risk and change management policies and adapt to new working conditions, figuring out transportation arrangements, PPE distribution, just to name a few steps. We have also seen CSOs and women's organizations step up, as is often the case, in crisis response, advocating for a survivor-centered, inclusive, and intersectional approach, and lobbying for resources and prioritization needed from governments and the donor community. Some member states have been leading the way in advocating for CSO support and women's leadership role in crisis response, as we will hear today. But we know that the needs and the pressure are enormous and more can be done to learn about how donors and member states can support these organizations in terms of collective and individual self-care, organizational resilience, and risk management now and beyond the crisis to ensure these CSOs, including the programs they deliver, not forgetting the movements that they lead, can survive and continue their work. In this session, therefore, we will be discussing 2 topics. The first one is the panel has been asked to share knowledge on how civil society organizations are responding institutionally and programmatically to the impact of COVID-19 on violence against women and girls, and whether these efforts are being recognized and or integrated into the national response and recovery efforts. Secondly, in a lightning round of feedback, the panel will make recommendations on how and what is needed to enable and empower civil society organizations, especially women's organizations, given their role as first responders during crises such as this one, such as COVID-19. After each topic is discussed, we will invite comments from the audience. Now, unfortunately, we will not have time for verbal commentary or questions and answer, but we do invite participants to use the chat box function to share your experiences and share your knowledge. We encourage an exchange of knowledge rather than questions. We want to know what you learn. Our moderators will select some of your examples to read aloud in contribution to the panel exchange. This knowledge exchange session will be documented and shared via the UN Trust Fund's website, and recommendation will be shared with the Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence. We also hope that this session will be useful for all of you participating today, that you will pick up tips and ideas for your own programs, research, and advocacy efforts, both from the panelists and through exchange via the chat function. Now, before we move on to introduce the panel, I just want to share with you some very basic housekeeping points. So just like in the first part, simultaneous interpretation will be available. At least one panelist will be speaking in Spanish. Our moderators will introduce themselves in the chat box in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish. Please feel free to add comments in all 3 languages. We will be keeping all microphones on mute, except for the panelists when it is time for them to speak. The session is being recorded. The comment box will be moderated, and interventions may be read aloud by UN Trust Fund staff in contribution to this session. Please do share your name, preferred pronouns, organization, and country if you feel comfortable doing so, alongside your comments. However, if you do not want your comments to be read out loud and or recorded in the written record of the meeting, please do make that clear in your comment as well. And as I'm sure you will, please keep all comments polite, respectful, and about this very important topic of conversation. We want this to be a safe space to share thoughts and knowledge. Disruptive participants may be removed from the session if needed. Now, I'm so pleased to introduce our wonderful panel in the order of speakers, which has been selected at random. Eunice Ndonga Gitinji, Executive Director from the Refugee Consortium Kenya. Angelica Maria Rivas Monge, lawyer and women's rights activist from the Asociación Colectiva de Mujeres para el Desarrollo Local from El Salvador. Lisa Mossberg, coordinator for the Strategy for Global Gender Equality and Women's and Girls' Human Rights in the Department for International Organizations and Policy Support of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. Shari Bonu Shonasimova, country representative for International Alert in Tajikistan. Victoria Spencer, senior policy advisor, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office from the United Kingdom. Kathleen Flynn Dapa, director, education, gender-based violence and child protection for Global Affairs, Canada. Dr. Mohamed El Holi, health program manager at Al Shehab Foundation for Comprehensive Development, Egypt. Shivananti Tanentiran, Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women in Bangladesh. Now, my colleague Gemma Wood, our knowledge manager at the UN Trust Fund, will be our moderator and timekeeper for those 2 topics. So now I will turn to you, Gemma, to kick off the first topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. So I will be acting as timekeeper today. So I do apologize if I have to ask you to stop. We'll have 3 minutes per participant for the first topic. And then for the second topic, it will be a lightning round of 1 minute each. So do forgive me if I have to ask you to stop and move on to the next participant. So without further ado, we're going to start with Eunice from the Refugee Council, Kenya, for the first topic on organizational and programmatic adaptations. Thank you, Eunice.
Good morning. Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to join you in this conversation. Refugee Consortium of Kenya is a national NGO in Kenya working to promote rights and dignity of refugees, IDPs, and host communities. We also do this through policy and legal advocacy. We also do capacity strengthening for stakeholders. We provide free legal aid and psychosocial services. And we also promote inclusive governance in our work, addressing gender-based violence and empowering women and girls is a focus for all our programs. in terms of what did we do at the onset of COVID-19, what civil society organizations like RCK were threatened into oblivion. If nothing happened, I think we would have closed down, thanks to the quick flexibility and the turnaround of UNTF, who are able to provide support in a flexible manner to be able to revamp our IT department so that we could be able to provide services online. We were able to adapt quickly to use technology such as Zoom and Microsoft Teams. And for that, we were able to continue engaging our stakeholders, but also be able to work remotely and be able to provide services to the refugees and particularly to women and girls. We were able to buy smartphones, airtime, and internet bundles, both for staff, but also for our community protection monitors who remained at the community level and became the link between us and the community, particularly bringing unto us the most critical issues around gender-based violence that were happening at the community. With the onset of COVID, there was a lot of uncertainties. And what we did is that we provided very critical information to women and girls, particularly information about COVID and the myths around it, Ministry of Health guidelines and protocols, but also about our services and the way we were going to provide the same services, particularly legal aid and psychosocial support services to refugee women and girls. We were able to do this through local radio, but also through WhatsApp platforms, but also through phone. And our community structures proved very important here. At the same time, in terms of access to justice, we were able to hold virtual court sessions for cases that had gone to court. And what we did is to bring together witnesses, prosecutors, and also the survivors at one place. We realized that most even police officers could not access internet connectivity, and they could also not access gadgets such as laptops so that they could be able to access court. And what that would mean is that cases would drag on for long. So our advocates would go to police stations, carrying our laptops, and then we'll bring together the survivors, the prosecutors, and the witnesses, and we would be able to attend courts together, and thereby our advocates would still now represent and also be able to do pre-trial counseling for witnesses and for survivors.
Thank you very much, Eunice. I'm sorry to pause you there, but thank you so much for that good range of the programmatic and organizational ways you've adapted. I'm sorry to cut you off. We'll now move on to Angelica, who's based in El Salvador, and I believe you will be speaking in Spanish just to warn people to adjust their interpretation. Thank you, Eunice. Over to you, Angelica.
Muy buenos días, muchas gracias por la invitación para hablar un poco de los aspectos relacionados a nuestra atención en relación al COVID-19. Como todos sabemos y conscientes de la situación de violencia que tenemos las mujeres y que un elemento muy importante que agudiza las situaciones de violencia para las mujeres son el permanecer en confinamiento. Las estadísticas nos han indicado que hay un alto porcentaje de los agresores son personas cercanas a la familia y por lo tanto esto agrava la situación de las mujeres. Previendo esta situación, como una forma de respuesta, la colectiva en El Salvador creó una línea de emergencia de atención donde habían 5 abogadas y 2 psicólogas atendiendo y acompañando telefónicamente a mujeres en situación de violencia. Esto ha requerido en muchas ocasiones y sobre todo durante el periodo de confinamiento una presencia o un seguimiento presencial y hemos además tenido un incremento de casos de más de 600 atenciones en menos de 9 meses. Se coordinó con al menos 6 municipalidades, que son los gobiernos locales, la realización de acciones donde las unidades móviles de sonido de las alcaldías realizaron recorridos en las colonias de mayor concentración poblacional con el objetivo de publicar mensajes de prevención de violencia en estas zonas en el país. Además, impulsamos una campaña que se denominó Que el tapabocas no te calle, esto mediante vallas publicitarias en carreteras, en zonas de comercio, en radios comerciales y comunitarias, publicidad en periódicos digitales y en redes sociales, esto con el objetivo de motivar a las mujeres a buscar ayuda ante situaciones de violencia y también indicarles a qué lugar acudir. Con el objetivo de conocer cómo ha impactado el COVID-19 en las medidas de aislamiento y excepción para los jóvenes y las mujeres en los territorios, realizamos una encuesta con más de 969 mujeres provenientes de 88 municipios de 12 departamentos, es decir, en más del 70% del territorio nacional. Y estos resultados nos establecieron la situación difícil respecto a la alimentación, la violación a derechos humanos como la salud y el libre tránsito, abandono de trabajo formal e informal, entre las cuales, digamos, se encuentran mujeres que ejercen el trabajo sexual, la imposibilidad de continuar con iniciativas económicas, sobre todo las mujeres que realizan trabajo en el sector informal, y además la carga de trabajo de doméstico y del cuidado. Para paliar esta situación que evidenció esta encuesta, se entregó alimentos y paquetes de higiene a mujeres organizadas de las zonas en las que trabaja la colectiva de diferentes regiones del país a 962 mujeres. Se contribuyó también con la entrega de aparatos tecnológicos a mujeres con liderazgo organizativo, principalmente rurales. Se les capacitó en el uso de las nuevas tecnologías para poder mantener la comunicación mediante reuniones virtuales y contribuir a que ellas puedan seguir haciendo sus labores de incidencia y defensa de los derechos. Por último, también realizamos una investigación sobre el impacto del COVID-19 en la vida de las mujeres. Analizamos aspectos como el acceso a la justicia para las mujeres que sufren violencia y el derecho a la salud. Esto nos ha permitido realizar acciones de incidencia con el gobierno central para contribuir a mejorar las condiciones de salud de las mujeres y de acceso a la justicia cuando están en procesos judiciales. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Angelica, and thank you for that good range of examples, including the campaign that you did on the radio, some great examples. Thank you very much to you. And now I will be turning to Lisa. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Gemma, Fiona, Liana, and everyone at UN Trust Fund for this important opportunity to share and learn together. And thank you to all women's rights organizations and civil society organizations participating here today for your important, transformative, and life-saving work. It is impressive to hear here today how you have adjusted, stepped up during this challenging time. This past year has been a year of learning and adjusting for us at SIDA as a donor as well. We have learned that we are dependent on information from partners and on strong partnerships. And we have learned that flexibility is good and core support is even better. I cannot stress enough how important the information that came out of the first dialogue that Trust Fund arranged last spring was for us. It certainly helped us understand the impacts of the pandemic, both of course, the alarming increase of violence against women and girls, and also how disrupted or lack of access to essential services for survivors and women and girls at risk would become a serious problem. That the Trust Fund and that dialogue meeting managed to amplify concrete examples and voices so early on was invaluable. When the pandemic continued, we all got aware that a crisis never happens in isolation. It's a health crisis to become an economic crisis and a democratic crisis. And as we knew already before, a crisis always affects the most poor and marginalized the most. But I think no one could foresee how the pandemic would also very quickly enhance the negative trend of the shrinking space and how that would influence the working conditions for women's rights organizations and women human rights defenders all over the world. At that time, it was important, more important than ever, to pursue a feminist development cooperation with flexibility and long-term partnership. We see that communicated early on that we would be flexible to necessary adjustments to ensure that partners' sustainability and capacity to provide a relevant response. And that we recognize the importance of keeping up the good work to do whatever possible in a specific setting to reach out to people at risk and in need of support. But also take care of each other and make sure there is a women's movement also after the pandemic, that we need to keep on working for gender equality and women's rights now, in the time we hope to see in front of us, the time after. It is challenging for a state authority to say, we are flexible, go ahead and do whatever you can. It was a useful lessons learned for us. And we, as I mentioned, we recognize now that core support is always better. We are so impressed by what partners like you kept on achieving. We have heard so many examples here of flexibility and agility, how to reach out and change working moods, and how innovative solutions came out of the crisis. So I would like to just finish by quoting what my minister, the Swedish Minister of Development Cooperation, said earlier today. The past year have taught us a lot about trust, interdependence, and flexibility. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and great to hear that feminist perspective and the importance of supporting the core needs of women's organizations and civil society. So now I'm going to turn to Sheri Banu in Tajikistan, working for International Alert. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. Hello, dear participants. International Alert is a British charity that operates in Tajikistan since 2008. And we implement a social economic combined approach currently with the support of UNTF in Tajikistan, which aims to empower women within their families, socially and economically, in order to enable them to protect themselves from violence against women and girls. The methodology is evidence-based and best practice, and it calls Zindagi Shoista in Tajik, that means living with dignity. We implemented our project, and due to COVID-19, we were forced to postpone some field activities. But luckily, we didn't stop entirely our activities. We just, as I said, postponed our field activities till August. And the women crisis centers that are managed by our local partners, they will operate, they continue to operate, providing much needed shelter, medical, psychological, and legal services.
You're breaking up a little bit, Sheri Banu. Is that So yes, thank you. Let's turn your video.
Children. We are very much appreciate that enabled us to. Sorry, yeah. Okay, and as I said, UNTF was very supportive. They were proactive in helping us to reallocate some funding in order to enable us to purchase some safety equipment, including sanitizers, masks, and gloves. And when we restarted our field activities in early September 2020, we were able to provide our beneficiaries with safety equipment that enabled us to lessen the spread of the infection. The local governments are aware of the efforts made by civil society in Tajikistan to prevent violence against women and girls, and particularly during the pandemic. And this was acknowledged by local and national governments. However, they don't have financial and human resources to tackle violence against women and girls. Therefore, they rely on civil society and the support of donor agencies. International Alert was proactive, and we produced a Tajik and English language briefing on the drivers of sexual and gender-based violence during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the importance of incorporating measures to prevent violence against women and girls into post-COVID recovery planning, including through women-focused income-generating activities and women economic empowerment. It is also being shared with international donor communities. Hopefully, this can start a conversation on it with national stakeholders and draw great attention to those organizations working to prevent violence against women and girls in Tajikistan. Unfortunately, the space for civil society is shrinking in Tajikistan, and the number of civil society that work to prevent violence against women and girls in Tajikistan is very few. And we hope that, the situation will change soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we could hear you clearly at the end. So thank you for your intervention and raising the importance of the protection of safety of beneficiaries in activities that we do and the protection you were able to provide, as well as the advocacy efforts. So thank you so much. Now I will turn to Victoria from the UK government. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I suppose my thoughts are very much echo Lisa from CEDA's points, really. I agree that the first session we did a year ago, where we heard directly from so many of you about the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic was having, increasing rates of violence, but also diverting services, the way that you were able to tell us about where the fault lines in the response already were, where were our blind spots, and particularly as well, how some of the most marginalized were left out or unable to access services, was really important. And we know from our other work on crises that violence against women and girls increases every time. So this time, at least in terms of the amount of noise on violence, it has felt different. And I think that is something we should really take stock about. Why have we had so much more attention this time, at least attention on the increase in violence and what happens to services in a crisis? And I think there is something about how some people think of violence, some states perhaps, think of violence as a private matter, and how that when they were enforcing lockdowns, they were suddenly feeling much more responsible for what happens behind closed doors. And one of my reflections is, how do we encourage them to retain that feeling of responsibility and invest more in both response and prevention? And we saw from UN Women and UNDP's work, looking at how gender responsive different national response plans to COVID have been around the world, that prevention of violence was a big gap. So that's definitely where we would like them to think more going forward. I think as well that we know that the COVID pandemic has retrenched gender roles and it is increasing gender inequality more broadly, and that we should prepare for a broader rollback of rights, of women's rights. And just over the weekend, we heard that Turkey's talking about leaving the Istanbul Convention or planning to leave the Istanbul Convention. And we recognize that it is women's rights organizations and movements that play the essential role in campaigning for that progressive legislation on violence, in resisting rollback on rights, and that we need to increase our support to you through funding, through platforms like this, but also in terms of increasing your profile, and that in turn, we need to make sure that we also keep the issue on the engagement agenda when we meet bilaterally with other member states. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for raising that important point of the integration of the response of civil society and women's organizations in national response, and the leadership of women's organizations in national response. I will move now to Kathleen from the Canadian government. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you so much. As the others have said, I'm really happy to be here today, but also to have participated in that first meeting that was organized by the UN Trust Fund at the beginning of the pandemic. That meeting and ongoing advice that we have continued to seek from women's rights organizations and girl-led organizations, both in Canada and abroad, have really guided our response to the pandemic. And some of that I know our minister has already shared with you. And so I'll just say a little bit more about some of what we've been doing. Certainly, using an intersectional feminist approach has helped us to prioritize action to address the gendered impacts of the pandemic and to target the most marginalized populations. And, that first meeting, and again today, what's so impressive is to actually be able to hear about sort of diverse impacts and evidence, whether that's for LGBTQI, women and girls with disabilities, women and girls in rural areas, refugees, IDPs, sex workers, the impact of related and the links between unpaid care and violence are also important to us. So we realize that in this time we need comprehensive approaches, but we also really do need to shift that focus to prevention. We need to double down on addressing these deep-rooted causes of gender inequality, which are worsening under COVID. And very early on, you were able to signal to us just how much this pandemic was both a great revealer of those inequalities, but has become the great amplifier of those inequalities. The disproportionate effects of the pandemic on women and girls, for us, have highlighted the importance of supporting civil society and women's rights organizations who are providing those essential services to marginalized populations through their networks and through a unique understanding of the specific needs and priorities of women and girls who are in these situations. So as the minister was saying, part of our COVID response has been to prioritize support to women's rights organizations on SRHR, on GBV. And we've done that by targeting support to women's rights organizations through our Women's Voice and Leadership Program, through the Equality Fund, and through the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women. What we wanted to do was tap into these organizations that are responsive to women's rights organizations, that are helping them to adapt, that are allowing for the flexibility that's needed, and that are advocating for women's and girls' rights in national COVID-19 responses, including on preventing sexual and gender-based violence. What we've learned, for example, from our Women's Voice and Leadership Program is that women's rights organizations challenge traditional understandings of what it means to respond to a crisis, and that the organizational capacity building and networking and advocacy that are done by these organizations are just as important to our COVID-19 response as the activities they do to provide basic services. The work of women's rights organizations has taught us that a strong COVID-19 response must ensure that any of the gains towards women's rights and gender equality are sustained and are nurtured well past the end of the pandemic. When we talk about resilience moving forward, at the heart of that resilience is the resilience of thriving women's rights organizations, of feminist movements, and of civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Thank you for all those good points and reminding us of the importance of taking an intersectional approach to meet the needs of the most marginalized. And on that, I'm going to turn to Mohammed, who works for Al Shahab in Egypt, where they do focus on some of the most marginalized women in urban communities. Go ahead, Mohammed. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma, and thank you for all your Trust Fund team, and thanks for the invitation to be with inspiring panelists here. Thanks for showing that we are complementing each other and working in such emergency situation. Firstly, what about Shahab? Shahab Foundation for Comprehensive Development is a non-governmental organization working on the development of informal areas and supporting the most disadvantaged population and socially excluded communities to improve the social and the economic situation within such communities. At the start of the pandemic, we launched an online questionnaire to understand the current situation of the emerging corona pandemic on the most vulnerable population, targeting women and girls living in the marginalized areas, mainly within the urban informal areas in Greater Cairo and Alexandria. In normal circumstances, women in this area suffer lack of education, poverty, gender-based violence, and financial circumstances. So it was crucial to get an in-depth understanding of their situation, especially in the current pandemic affecting the whole world. Our survey is conducting through the outreach and social workers of the Shahab Foundation, trying to explore the different issues that the women encounter during COVID-19. So we collected inputs and gathering recommendation and perception on long and short-term solutions. The survey showed that there was a need for retailoring our programs to respond to the new reality of the COVID-19 era and the impact of lockdowns and social distancing. So our program needed to become more flexible and accommodate the new circumstances, and also to guarantee sustainability of our program with the presence of COVID-19. So we created two adjusted or new modalities for our service provision. Firstly, the maintenance of the physical service provision with all safety measures. The second one is establish an electronic platform for the service, especially for the psychological support, legal counseling, and also we observed an increase on the rate of the violence during the time of lockdown. So we created, I'm really sorry about the light. So I will stop the video to focus on the presentation. I'm really sorry about the light. In addition, we are able to reprogram some existing funds from failed activities that were not implemented because of COVID-19 to deliver direct financial aid to some of the women who needed the most, those who were at risk or experiencing violence, this including support for a group of women living in slum areas to be able to pay the rent for 3 and access to food packages. And here I would like to thank you in Trust Fund for the flexibility of the funding to make us do such aid. We started also to focus beyond the COVID-19, as we wanted to make sure that the different service for women survivors of violence and the other will be sustained without interruption during COVID-19. After that, or even with any similar crisis, therefore, Shahab started working with different stakeholders, including governmental entities, UN agencies, and representatives of the women themselves to develop a plan that include procedures and actions to be taken to ensure continuity of the service during such crisis or such disaster. Thank you, everyone, and I'm really sorry again for the light.
Thank you, Mohammed, and I hope you get the lights back soon. Thank you for raising the importance of data that you collected through the survey, and also that your last point about that you were actively involved as an organization in the local and national response, which is good. good news. So now I will turn to Savanthi, who is, I believe, based in Malaysia, but implementing a project in Bangladesh. Thank you, Savanthi.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Arrow is a regional feminist organization based in Malaysia, and we work in 15 countries in Asia Pacific, and we aim to achieve an equal, just, and equitable world that enables all women to be equal citizens in all aspects of our lives, right? And protects and advances our sexual and reproductive health and rights. So COVID-19 was a very challenging time for us on the ground. We witnessed, renewed poverty and marginalized across the region, and with much suffering on all fronts, whether it was the economy, increase in violence, political marginalization of women's rights organization, and of course, that all-encompassing health crisis, which was just not about the pandemic, but all aspects of sexual and reproductive health were affected. So the COVID-19 pandemic also further weakened the protection mechanisms, against violence which are available to women and girls, especially women and girls with disabilities in Asia. So women and girls with disabilities are already subject to intersecting forms of discrimination, which is related to our sexual and reproductive health and gender-based violence, legal protection, unpaid care, and domestic work. So Arrow, with the support of local partners, worked to raise awareness about the issue and call upon governments in South Asia to address the increase of gender-based violence against women and domestic violence in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. This also included a joint submission, which was prepared and submitted to the Human Rights Council on the Rights of the Child by Arrow and partners from 6 countries in the Asia and the Pacific region, which included Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Nepal, Pakistan, and the Philippines. This submission includes input from our partner, Women Disabilities Development Forum, WDDF, which is a local partner supported by the UNTF project, which is implementing a project in Bangladesh, which highlighted how the pandemic and lockdown is also affecting women and girls with disabilities. And this information was actually based on the experiences of WDDF and the reports that they generated on incidents of violence being perpetrated against women and girls with disabilities. Like many of the other panelists have seen, that COVID-19 also pushed Arrow and our partners to search for models of working internally as an organization through virtual and digital means, and also for working externally with partners in advocacy engagements at regional and global levels through these virtual and digital means. So Arrow and our partners made a strategic shift to this digitalization to be effective in raising the awareness and voices around the work and the perspective from the region. But with the key, our reason for utilizing the digitalization strategically is to fill this digital gap between the national and community level, and of course the global levels, and to ensure that we and our partners can be this effective bridge between the national, regional, and global. So in light of that, we had to extend capacity building to all of our partners, which including technical support through webinars on what is online and social media advocacy, what are the tools and the different platforms available for this, and also how to create, content for online activism. The second thing they asked for, and which we provided, was flexibility in the implementation of activities, because we had to postpone and change the modality of some of these activities. The third we created a COVID-19 partner support group, which shared information, including funding opportunities, capacity strengthening opportunities through webinars and other sessions, and opportunities also for advocacy engagement, such as endorsing or providing inputs to call to action statements. And we also managed to do monetary support to 10 organizations with Arrow's Relief Fund to support them with the COVID-19 response. And this was a very bunch of activities, such as awareness building on COVID risks to rural women, ensuring, masks, sanitizers, and, protective equipment supplies to ensure health and safety of LGBT people, these are the people who are generally, they're marginalized from information and resources. So I'm very happy to hear the call that, to ensure sustainability of the agenda, we really need to ensure the sustainability of women's rights organizations. And to do that, we have to ensure the health, safety, and resilience of our organizations, our staff, our partners, and our communities.
Thank you so much, Samantha, and thank you for raising all those excellent points and for great news that you've been able to do advocacy across the region. And you also shared some resources I saw in the comments for the people to have a look for more information. So that's the end of topic 1. We heard a range of programmatic and organizational adaptations and efforts across research, advocacy, and programmatic. And we heard from our donors and member states, Canada, Sweden, UK, and how they've been adjusting to be flexible and supportive and playing their role in advocacy at a global level. So now we'll move on to topic 2, and this will be a quick fire round where each panelist will have about 1 minute to say, well, what next? We have a danger of preaching to the converted in our group. So what recommendations should we put forward to the global community, to member states particularly, on how we can enable women's rights organizations and civil society to play their key leadership role in the response. And we at the UN Trust Fund will pledge to put these recommendations forward to the group of the Action Coalition, who will be at the Mexico Forum next week. So to kick that off, I will turn back to our first speaker, Eunice in Kenya. Thank you, Eunice.
Thank you very much, Gemma. In terms of recommendations, CSOs are in the community before the crisis, during the crisis, and during the recovery period. It is important that we build their resilience so that they are able to adapt to the shocks when they come, and so that they can continue providing principled, dignified, and effective response and support to women and girls who are going through violence. In addition, I think I can't reiterate more the issue of core, flexible, and long-term financing, which will ensure sustainability of CSOs and women rights organizations, and thereby increase their capacity to be able to even become more innovative during crisis and be able to sustain themselves, but also to sustain the drive to support women and girls who are going through violence in a very fast-changing environment, and also in a very complex world in terms of the new forms of gender violence. So it is important that the funding is not just flexible and core, but it's also long-term.
Thank you, Eunice. Excellent point about the need for long-term funding. And now over to Angelica in El Salvador.
Muchas gracias, Gemma. Sí, desde El Salvador consideramos importante dentro de las recomendaciones promover la investigación sobre las consecuencias que está teniendo el COVID-19 en la vida de las mujeres en nuestros países. También consideramos importante que las agencias de cooperación y organismos internacionales revisen sus políticas de cooperación con el fin de redireccionar los recursos con criterios de apoyo al rescate económico de las mujeres, la Contraloría Ciudadana por medio de los mecanismos de supervisión gestionados por la sociedad civil, para verificar que los gobiernos impulsen programas de recuperación económica con enfoque de género, para evitar que estas consecuencias que está teniendo el COVID-19 agudicen aún más la desigualdad de género, que obligue, por ejemplo, a mujeres que están en situación de violencia a tener que quedarse con sus agresores por un tema de falta de autonomía económica. Además, consideramos que a nivel local debemos incidir en la atención oportuna a mujeres en situación de violencia, que se prioricen también las acciones de prevención y evitar mayores retrocesos de los que ya estamos teniendo, para que los recortes económicos que hagan los gobiernos en este contexto no afecten más la garantía de los derechos de las mujeres, y revisar también la carga del trabajo del cuidado que actualmente están asumiendo principalmente las mujeres. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, and such an important point about the intersections between the pressure on women in terms of unpaid care work, etc., and the risk of violence and the holistic approach that's needed. So now I will turn back to Lisa from the Swedish government. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. The action coalitions are important to accelerate action, and it's so important that the work in the action coalitions results in strong commitments now. It's important that they cover both the normative framework and national legislation, as well as funding commitments for evidence-driven prevention strategies. I'm pleased to see that financing and implementation of strategies and services also in humanitarian settings is spelled out. That is important. And of course, action 4 in the draft actions is close to my heart. Funding to youth and women-led women's rights organizations as key stakeholders in the work to eliminate violence against women is important. It's important that we have facts on the table. We know that there is women rights organizations are underfunded. So a message to the Action Coalition is, of course, to set up tools for measuring the gap as well as funding provided. And I'm pleased to let you know that SIDA in our new action plan for gender equality has spelled out that increased funding to women's rights organizations is a key priority in all development cooperation from us, bilateral strategies as well as regional and global strategies. Thank you.
And thank you so much for that very specific and strong commitment, Lisa. Thank you. And now I will turn back to Sharibano in Tajikistan.
Thank you. Despite high levels of violence against women and girls in Tajikistan and other Central Asian countries, unfortunately, Central Asia and particularly Tajikistan is not a priority country for many donors. The government, as I mentioned earlier, does not have the resources or political will to address the issue properly. And the situation aggravated due to the COVID-19 circumstances. And as mentioned earlier, the space for civil society in Tajikistan is shrinking, and responsibility sits with only a handful of local civil society organizations who are struggling to secure resources to help women in need. There are not enough civil society in Tajikistan dealing with violence against women and girls. And those civil society organizations who are existing, they generally are located in urban centers, meaning that poor, isolated rural areas and the vulnerable women and girls, they cannot be covered. I therefore urge the donor community to allocate more resources to prevent violence against women and girls in Tajikistan and Central Asia, both to encourage the government to take firmer action and make good on its international commitments to prevent violence against women and girls, and also to extend civil society organizations, women rights organizations, to strengthen support infrastructure to vulnerable women and girls, and build their capacity to provide critical services. And our practice showed that a family-centered socio-economic approach is working well in the Central Asia context, particularly in Tajikistan. And for us, in order to effectively tackle the issue of violence against women and girls, we should use a social combined and family-centered approach.
Thank you. Thank you very much for raising the important issue of very specific needs in certain regions, such as Central Asia, where every region can have specific contextual needs. But again, the issue of shrinking space is common amongst many. Just to say that we're having maybe some slight issues with the chat function. We are encouraging you all to contribute your ideas and chats, recommendations, and resources. If you're having trouble sending your comment, please send it directly to Chloe Meyerson, M-E-Y-E-R-S-O-N, and then she will copy and paste your comment into the chat box. Thank you. So now I will turn to Victoria.
Thank you. So what shall we do? I think as the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, we will continue to argue through our humanitarian and other funding and response for GBV services to be recognised as essential and life-saving, and that women's rights organisations are essential providers. We will work to continue to safeguard civil society spaces and protect women human rights defenders. We know that you can best exercise your expertise if you're given a seat at the table and if we support your meaningful participation and leadership. I know you've long made the case for investing in locally led solutions and for us as donors to provide long-term, flexible and core funding. And do you know, I think you might finally be getting through to us. We're really glad that the UN Trust Fund and others are responding to this, and want to reassure the Trust Fund that you have the UK's backing to be really ambitious on this going forward. And I know that in return that what we ask of the Trust Fund also has to be really carefully thought through, and that we need to balance what we ask in terms of our own due diligence requirements with your need to invest in those locally led solutions and provide that core flexible funding. And in that way, I hope that we'll really act out what we know is important in terms of mutual accountability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. And in the interest of time, I'll turn straight to Kathleen in Canada. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thanks so much. You know, during the pandemic, women's rights organizations have become more central to maintaining and amplifying the development impact in both the response and the recovery efforts. And I just quickly going back to Eunice's words about building resilience, it's absolutely essential to how we're going to move forward in our response, which, as Aldiana said, is going to be at different paces across the globe, and as we move into recovery and resilience. So for us, indeed, the flexible funding for women's rights organizations is a key enabler for those effective results. It's allowing women's rights organizations to adapt to these emerging challenges, fulfill their core mandates, and ensure that these critical advances in gender equality are not reversed. So we will continue to advocate for the important role of women's rights organizations and girl-led civil society organizations in the Generation Equality Forum. As a co-leader of the Feminist Movements and Leadership Action Coalition, this is a core part of our advocacy, but also wanting us to look at how we ensure that women's rights organizations are central to all the action areas. And then I would encourage everyone to look at the commitments in the Feminist Movements and Leadership Action Coalition and reflect on how they fit and advance ones in others. For example, you know, Action 4 in the GBV Coalition. For us, that leadership role will provide opportunities to advocate for enhanced resources and support to feminist organizations and movements in the context of COVID-19, but also, you know, moving forward. And I think it's even more important than ever that there is this longer track to this Generation Equality Forum, because we're really going to need to put some concerted effort into these issues now more than ever. Based on the lessons from COVID-19 and with our feminist approach, we will continue to consult women's rights organizations and girls' organizations on crisis management, on effective coordination and integration between humanitarian development and peace-building actors and efforts. And we'll strive to improve our funding mechanisms as well to ensure that they are flexible, stable, and accessible to diverse women's rights organizations and girl-led organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Thank you. Now I'll turn back to Mohammed. I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Thank you, Gemma. In terms of the recommendation, we as HAB divided the recommendation in two stages. Firstly, during the pandemic and any other pandemic, not COVID, by the way, but funding and the political support is needed to provide different modalities of service provision through technology and innovation to accelerate response, transforming service provision beyond the traditional ways. You need to be innovative to reach to all the people. Secondly, to ensure that gender-based violence during such a crisis is a cross-cutting issue in all governmental and non-governmental developmental programs, and in all service being provided. Thirdly, to provide a psychological support to all violence survivors by the relation of the pandemic and anxiety and the trauma. Second stage and more strategic way post-COVID and for any emergency situations that we can face. That the most important thing for meeting the needs of the most vulnerable and the marginalized population and their vulnerabilities to violence, to address their socioeconomic and health conditions, we need to improve and finance social protection schemes to ensure that they are inclusive and gender sensitive to accommodate the needs of women. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those concrete recommendations, Mohammed. And very important about taking an integrated approach to GBV across sectors. Thank you. And now we'll go to our last speaker in this segment, Savanthi, to close us on the recommendations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gemma. So ARA is also part of the Action Coalition leadership on bodily autonomy and SRHR. And we believe that this Action Coalition is a timely space for feminist and women's rights organizations to share their expertise and experiences and lead, gender equality and women's human rights issues in shaping the priorities of governments and private sector around these critical themes. So one of the recommendations I would really strongly like to make is that we have to look at the intersections between SRHR and gender-based violence and our responses as a global community towards this, and our work on women and girls with disabilities through this UNTF project has shown us the critical need for these intersectional approaches to make a difference for the groups that are left behind. We can already see increasing numbers of early age marriage due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is an intersectional issues between both of our action coalitions, but also other issues like increased violence in girls who are married young, and the issues of FGMC are also critical for us to work together. The second recommendation is that technology, it now enables that participation, but for it to be meaningful, we have to enable as many marginalized groups to be able to participate and to be involved, because these are the groups that are going to be able to harness the political will of governments. And of course, for this to happen, we need to ensure that the grassroots women's rights organizations and feminist organizations are fully funded to carry out the critical work that we do.
Thank you. And that was very rich. And that's the close of our last topic. So we had some really fruitful examples of how organizations have been programmatically and organizationally adapting that can show evidence of how we can support organizations through their core funding, etc., to be more resilient through future crises in support of women, and some really strong recommendations at the end to take forward with our colleagues working on the Action Coalitions, including some of you are on the Action Coalitions and who will be there in Mexico Forum. Now, we had a few issues with the chat box, but I am going to just read out a few contributions that came in before we close. So the panelists can take a breath now, and I just want to say thank you so much for your interventions. They were so fruitful, and it was wonderful to hear from you all. In contribution from some of our participants online, we had a contribution from our grantee partner CIHA Network and Martha, who is they're based in South Sudan. And on the topic 1, they said that they have been training and mobilizing women into community action groups in using mobile phone technology to safely document GBV cases and sexual violence cases, to share this document with their team on the ground. They have been training the women in making locally made sanitary materials and cloth face masks. And as an organization, we have adapted to more virtual modalities for meetings. We've also mainstreamed a sub-granting modality to support grassroots women's organizations and collectives that are not able to access funding. And these sub-grants or seed funding have enabled these organizations and groups to sustain their critical grassroots work. And you can find out more of their work on their website, www.action.org. www.chihanet.org. Thank you so much for that example. And so important about the point of digital technology. We've heard about that through some of the panelists, about moving to the digital age and new technologies, which is so fruitful for our work, but also does come with some risks. And then from our colleagues and grantees in Uganda, IDIWA, they have commented that they have been able to support 300 women and girls with disabilities with legal services through the crisis, especially those suffering violence. And they've been supplying relief food and masks and adapting to virtual working methods to enable them to continue working and sharing with partners. So thank you for that example. And then we have a comment from Ulosulu Ulani. I'm sorry you didn't say which organization you're from, but thank you for your individual comment that funding organizations through CSOs should help in empowering and do more on capacity development of women for better livelihoods for them and their families. And also more CSOs should be encouraged and sponsored to be involved in solving the issues of violence against women. So thank you for that good point about supporting women's economic empowerment and that of their families as a way to mitigate the risk of violence. And you also follow on to say that more research and work and data gathering is needed, especially during the pandemic. Violence against women is believed to be at the highest order of priority to get lasting solutions, achieve better and longer term management of violence against women, even after the pandemic, indeed. So thank you so much for those were the primary comments we received. We will be following up with a chance for you to provide more information. But on that, I'm going to turn back to Fiona, who will give us her closing remarks and thanks. Over to you, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Thank you to all our panelists for these constructive and inspiring remarks, and to the audience for participating as well. We have learned a lot today about the adjustments being made due to COVID-19 and how we can better support civil society, especially women's organizations, in the crisis and beyond. We have heard about efforts to adjust programmatic response to meet the needs of the most marginalized communities, including women and girls refugees and women and girls with disabilities, and the importance of advocating for crisis response to be intersectional and inclusive. We have heard about efforts to maintain service delivery and essential prevention through digital means and the challenges and opportunities that accompany this. As Sivananthi from Arrow highlighted, the digital gap is real, and there are enormous benefits to breaking this divide for EVA efforts and the empowerment of women. However, online methods are not suitable for all communities and interventions. Hence, our panelists talked about the importance of maintaining physical reach to targeted communities and women and girls in need. Emergency hotlines, health and safety equipment, transport, protective measures are essential to maintain response and prevention efforts for all in a time of heightened risk. One of the main takeaways of this discussion, however, is that combined, continued and adaptive donor support is crucial to ensure civil society can use funds flexibly to maintain themselves, their programs, and their movements. We also heard about the commitment of some donors and member states, true civil society allies, trailblazing with their feminist policies, who recognize that flexibility is good and core support is even better, to quote Lisa, to support the resilience of feminist movements during and after the pandemic. Through this discussion, we have successfully documented a range of programmatic and organizational adaptations. We have also received a list of concrete recommendations on what is needed to enable and empower civil society organizations, especially women's organizations, given their role as first responders during the crisis. As this session is drawing to a close, I would like to inform you about some next steps. Firstly, the UN Trust Fund will document this session and share recommendation with the GBV Action Coalition prior to the Mexico Forum next week. A summary will also be available on our website in due course. Secondly, we will also use the information shared to inform our programming and advocacy response, including a third brief on the impact of COVID-19 on violence against women and CSOs, to be released in a few months. To inform this process, we will be sending out an optional questionnaire on the topic to all our current and former grantees to gather more information. So please kindly look out for this questionnaire. In the coming months, the UN Trust Fund will also be releasing a series of knowledge briefs on learning from practice in the prevention of violence against women, with a focus on specific approaches, including community mobilization and working with adolescents and working with faith-based and traditional actors. This series, with the support from Wellspring Philanthropic Fund, will include sections on adaptations during the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, we are also delighted to announce that the UN Trust Fund's new strategic plan for 2021 to 2025 will be released shortly, so please watch out for that. We welcome any other thoughts or comments on how the UN Trust Fund could play a role in continuing this conversation and supporting CSOs. But our last word must go to thanking all the panelists for their time and important insights today. Thank you so much for your interventions, and to the audience for their participation. We wish you all a very stay safe. Goodbye, au revoir, and adios.